Hi, this is Kendall Boyson, professional life and recovery coach, and you're listening to Encouragementology, the practice of instilling hope. Hi there. Thanks for joining me. On this show, we're exploring air and light, clearing stagnation without forcing a fix, and why sometimes the spaces in our lives that feel overwhelming, forgotten, or beyond repair may not need a dramatic overhaul. They might just need a little air and light. Have you ever walked into a room that's been closed up for years? The air feels thick. The smell is stale. The silence almost hums. You hesitate before stepping in, not because it's dangerous, but because it feels untouched, undisturbed, like time stopped there. That's exactly what we were facing with the basement of an old building we own. It hadn't seen the light of day in more than 50 years. 50 years of stillness, dust, layered like history, corners that held who knows what. And as we stood there, talking about what it would take to fix it, clean it, repair it, my father-in-law said something so simple, it almost felt too easy. It just needs a little air and light. Air and light. Not a demolition plan, not a complicated formula, not a weekend of intense problem solving. Just open the windows, let it breathe, let the sun in. And that sentence has stayed with me. Because how many areas of our lives feel like that basement? An old belief about ourselves, a past mistake, a relationship dynamic, a dream we shelved, something that hasn't seen the light of day in a long time. We assume it feels heavy, we must attack it, fix it, force change. But what if the first step isn't force? What if it's exposure? What if stagnation isn't always a sign of damage, but simply a sign that something has been sealed too tightly for too long? Today, I want to explore what happens when we stop trying to renovate everything and instead just open a window. Because sometimes clarity doesn't come from intensity. Sometimes it comes from air and light. So let's talk about what we actually mean when we say air and light, because we're not just talking about windows and basements. Air is movement, circulation, freshness. It disrupts what has settled for too long. When air moves through a space, it doesn't force change. It simply shifts what's been sitting still. Light is exposure, illumination, clarity. It reveals what's already there. It doesn't create the dust, it shows it. And here's what I love about this metaphor. Neither air nor light are aggressive. They're natural, steady. They don't shout, they don't attack, they don't bulldoze. They allow. We are so conditioned to believe that if something feels off, heavy, or broken, we need a strategy, a plan, a formula. We reach for intensity. We think if we push hard enough, think hard enough, analyze deeply enough, we'll finally fix it. But what if some things in our lives aren't asking to be fixed? What if they're asking to be seen? Think about something that feels stagnant in your life right now. Maybe it's an old idea about yourself. I'm no good with money. I always mess things up. I'm not creative. These statements might have formed years ago, and they've just been sitting there, unquestioned. Or maybe it's an unresolved conversation, a memory you don't revisit, a dream you quietly tucked away because life got too busy. When something hasn't seen the light of day in a long time, it can start to feel bigger than it really is. The longer it stays sealed, the more our imagination fills in the gaps. And here's the thing about air and light. They shrink distortion. When you open a window, the smell dissipates. When you turn on the light, shadows lose their drama. The object itself hasn't changed, but your perspective has. And sometimes that's enough to begin. I think we underestimate how powerful gentle exposure can be. Not dramatic confession or emotional excavation, just acknowledgement. I haven't looked at this in a while. This belief might be outdated. This hurt might need a little oxygen. Air and light don't rush transformation. They create the conditions for it. And maybe that's the shift we need to consider. Instead of asking, how do I fix this? Maybe we ask, have I let this breathe? That question alone can change everything. There's a well-known quote from Justice Louis Brandeis that says, sunlight is said to be the best of disinfectants. It's just a simple sentence, but think about it. Sunlight doesn't scrub, it doesn't argue, it doesn't fight, it just simply exposes. And exposure changes everything. When something is brought into the light, distortion fades, secrecy loses power, fear shrinks to its actual size. The idea shows up in psychology too. Research around emotional regulation has found that simply labeling an emotion reduces its intensity. When you say, I feel anxious, instead of just spinning in anxiety, the brain actually calms. The amygdala, the part responsible for threat response, becomes less reactive when emotions are named. In other words, when you give something air, your nervous system settles. You don't solve the entire problem. You just stop fighting the darkness alone. There's also a concept in trauma therapy called gradual exposure. Instead of forcing someone to relive or reprocess something all at once, they approach it slowly, safely, with light. The goal isn't overwhelm, it's integration. And I love that because it pushes back on the idea that growth has to be dramatic to be real. Even spiritually, this metaphor shows up. In the Gospel of John, it says, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Light doesn't wrestle with darkness. It simply exists, and darkness retreats. Air and light are not violent forces. They're steady ones. And maybe that's why they work. Here's what stands out to me about all of this. Most of what we fear grows in isolation. Silence, secrecy, suppression. Shame thrives in darkness. Resentment hardens without circulation. And old beliefs, they calcify when they're never questioned. But when you gently expose them, not to shame yourself or fix everything instantly, but simply to see clearly, something softens. Sometimes we don't need a breakthrough, we just need brightness. Sometimes we don't need a total personality overhaul, but just some fresh air. And the beautiful part? Air and light are free. They're available and they don't require perfection, performance, or even readiness. They just require openness. So let's make this real for a minute. I want you to think of one area of your life that feels stagnant, not catastrophic, not your biggest trauma, just something that feels stuck. Maybe it's a conversation you've been avoiding. Maybe it's a belief about yourself that you haven't questioned in years. Maybe it's a project that's been sitting untouched because you don't know where to start. Now, instead of asking, how do I fix this? I want you to ask a different question. Has this had any air lately? Have I talked about it? Have I written about it? Have I said it out loud without editing myself? Or has it just been sitting in a sealed mental basement? Now ask yourself, has this had any light? Have I looked at it with today's wisdom? Have I questioned whether the story I'm telling myself is still accurate? Have I examined it with curiosity instead of judgment? Because here's what we tend to do. We either ignore something completely or we attack it. We either shut the door and pretend it's not there, or we storm in with a sledgehammer. What if neither approach is necessary? Imagine this instead. You walk down into that basement. You don't start rearranging boxes and you don't start scrubbing the walls. You simply crack a window. Maybe you prop open the door. You let the space breathe. You stand there for a moment and you just observe. What changes first? Usually it's not the objects. It's the atmosphere. And that's what we're after. Sometimes the shift isn't in solving the issue, it's in softening the tension around it. So here's a gentle experiment for this week. Choose one thing that feels stale. Don't fix it, just expose it. Tell someone safe, I've been carrying this. Journal one honest page about it. Revisit it with adult eyes instead of the age you were when it formed. Let it breathe. Notice what shifts when it's no longer sealed, because stagnation often isn't a sign that something's broken. It's a sign that something hasn't had air. So what do we do with this? How do we bring air and light into a situation without turning it into a full-blown renovation project? Because I know how we think. If we decide to work on something, we immediately imagine hours of journaling, deep conversations, major life decisions. We escalate quickly. But air and light are subtle. So, here are 4 gentle, practical ways to introduce them. First, name it simply. Not dramatically, not with a full backstory and justification, just a sentence. I've been avoiding this. I'm still hurt about that. I think I might have outgrown this role. I'm afraid I'll fail. Naming something is light. You don't need a 5-part explanation. Clarity begins with honesty. Second, externalize it. Write it down on paper or speak it into a voice memo. Tell one trusted friend. When something leaves your internal loop and becomes external, it gets oxygen. It stops bouncing around in the dark corners of your mind and starts existing in the open. Third, update the story. Some of the things sitting in our emotional basement formed decades ago. They were conclusions we made with limited information. Ask yourself, is this belief still accurate? You may discover it was true once, but it's outdated now. And that realization alone can feel like opening a window. Fourth, change one physical environment. This might sound small, but it's actually powerful. Open an actual window. Rearrange a room or clear one drawer. Wash something that's been sitting untouched. There's something about literal air and light that signals safety to your nervous system. It tells your body, we're not trapped. And sometimes when your body feels free, your thoughts follow. Notice what we're not doing. We're not forcing closure or demanding resolution or requiring perfection. We're creating conditions. Air and light don't rush transformation. They prepare the space for it. And sometimes, preparation is the bravest step of all. The A side is the familiar story we all know, but the B side, that's where the deeper tracks live. The A side says, let it have air and light. And the B side asks, why haven't you? Because sometimes we avoid air and light on purpose, not because we want to stay stuck, but because exposure feels risky. If I turn on the light, I might see how much dust has gathered. If I open the window, I might realize something really does need attention. If I let it breathe, I might have to admit I've outgrown something or someone. Darkness can feel protective. When something is sealed off, it stays contained and undefined. As long as it's undefined, we don't have to act. Air and light bring clarity, and clarity can require change. That's the tension. We say we want relief, but sometimes what we fear is visibility, because visibility removes denial. If I admit I'm unhappy, I may have to adjust something. If I admit I'm still hurt, I may have to forgive. If I admit I want more, I may have to stretch. But here's the hopeful turn. Exposure doesn't just reveal what's broken. It also reveals what's still strong. You might discover it's not nearly as damaged as you imagined. That relationship may just need a conversation. That dream may still have life in it. That part of you that felt lost may simply be dormant. Seeds begin in darkness, but they aren't meant to stay there. Air and light don't destroy what's growing. They awaken it. Once something has air and light, it's no longer trapped, and neither are you. There's an old story about a man who inherited his grandfather's workshop. It had been closed up for years. The windows were painted shut. The air was thick, tools hung on the walls covered in dust. The wooden table in the center looked gray instead of oak. Standing in the doorway, he felt overwhelmed. He thought about ripping everything out and starting over, It seemed easier to gut the space than deal with decades of neglect. But instead of swinging a hammer, he pried open the windows. He let the air move. He wiped one small section of the table. As the sunlight streamed in, something surprising happened. The wood wasn't ruined. Beneath the dust, it was solid. The tools weren't useless, they just needed cleaning. The room didn't require demolition, it required exposure. Day by day, with the windows open, the space transformed. Not because he forced it, but because he let it breathe. The workshop had never been broken. It had just been sealed. And that's the moral, isn't it? What we assume is damaged may simply be untouched. What feels overwhelming may simply need atmosphere. Sometimes restoration doesn't begin with force. It begins with air and light. If this idea of air and light is stirring something in you, I want to invite you to sit with it a little longer. And remember, there's a 5-day journaling companion available for download if you want to go deeper and really explore this in a more structured way. For now, let's start gently. Here are a few prompts to reflect on as you think about exposing what's holding you back in your life right now. 1. What in my life feels sealed off or stagnant right now? What have I been avoiding looking at? What feels heavier than it probably needs to be? If I'm honest, what part of this have I kept in the dark? 2. What would air look like in this situation? Would it mean talking about it with someone safe? Would it mean writing one honest page without filtering? Would it mean simply admitting how I really feel? 3. What would light look like? Have I examined this with my current wisdom, or am I still reacting from an older version of myself? Is the story I'm telling still accurate? What might change if I looked at this with curiosity instead of criticism? And here's one more to sit with quietly. If this area of my life had just a little more air and light, what might become possible? You don't have to solve anything tonight. You don't need a 5-step plan. Just crack the window. Let the questions circulate. Let the light in slowly. Sometimes reflection itself is the first breath of fresh air. So let's gather this up. Today we talked about air and light, clearing stagnation without forcing a fix. I love metaphors. It just gives me a visual picture of what we're talking about, and it helps me apply it to not just the basement, which by the way is super clean today, but to every aspect of our lives. So we started with the basement that hadn't seen the light of day in more than 50 years. And instead of demolition, the answer was simple. Open the window, let in some air and light. Air is movement, light is clarity. Neither are aggressive, neither demand perfection. They simply create conditions where change can happen naturally. We also explored how so much of what feels overwhelming in our lives may not be broken. It may just be sealed, like old beliefs or unresolved hurts, forgotten dreams. The longer they sit in the dark, the heavier they feel. But exposure shrinks distortion. Naming something calms the nervous system. Speaking something reduces its power. So get to talking. We also looked at the B side. The truth that sometimes we avoid air and light because visibility requires honesty. And honesty can require change. But exposure doesn't only reveal what's damaged, it often reveals what's still strong, what's still usable or alive or possible. You don't have to renovate your whole life. You might just need to open a window. Sometimes the bravest step isn't fixing, it's letting something breathe. If you want to share encouragementology with a friend who needs to know they're not alone in this journey of self-discovery, you can visit encouragementology.com or anywhere you stream your content to receive this episode and all others. Check out the show notes for the 5-day journaling companion. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram for additional encouragement throughout the week. So I challenge you. Choose one area of your life that has felt stagnant and give it a little air and light. Don't fix it. Don't overhaul it. Simply expose it. Say it out loud, write it down, or look at it honestly with fresh eyes. Open the window and let it breathe. I know you can do it. Thank you for listening to Encouragementology with Kendall Boyson, where we find positive ways to handle some of life's challenges.
Stumbled through until the path was clear. That's when I found you and how I wound up here. All I needed was a rock that I could lean on. All you needed was some wind beneath your wings. We might be seeing things from different points of view, but that don't mean a thing. You and I, we were meant to be. I was made for you, you were made for me. So let it happen naturally. Things will work out fine, just you wait and see. Oh, you sat across my lap one summer night. There was only one star out, but it was shining bright. So I held you in my arms with all my might. It felt good to be in love again. I didn't want that night to end. But all I needed was a little motivation. All you needed was a light to guide the way. We might disagree until we drive each other crazy, but things should be okay. You and I, we were meant to be. I was made for you, you were made for me. So let it happen naturally. Things will work out fine, just you wait and see. I have never felt this way before. Every time you leave, you always leave me wanting more. It wasn't long before I knew that no one else would ever do. I only hope you feel it too. On a Monday afternoon, when you caught me staring at you from across the room. There was only one star out that night, but I made